Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today. We are going to get started in just a moment, but while we're still having folks jump in and joining us, I wanted to kick things off with a little bit of information about our webinar tool today. We're using Zoom and everyone will remain muted throughout the presentation. We would love to invite you to participate if you have a question by using the Q&A feature. If you hover towards the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see that and invite you to submit questions to our panelists. There will be time at the end of the presentation for them to answer questions, and for you, you're welcome to submit throughout. We will be sharing an archive of this webinar and a copy of the slides after the presentation. I know that's a really common question, so you will definitely be getting an email with that information to access both of those. And in addition, throughout the presentation, we invite you to use the chat window for any comments. Please do use the Q&A feature for questions. And right now, we'd love to invite you to, as people are still joining, to use the chat window to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from. And with that, I will look forward to seeing your introductions, and I will hand it over to Clark McCowan.
Thanks very much, Nova, and welcome everyone to the fourth in our webinar series on the Michigan Department of Education SEL competencies, with a focus on what each competency is and how to assess and address those. Today we're going to be focusing on relationship skills, but I want to just mention a couple things before we go into the presentation. One is that in case Nova mentioned this, but I just want to repeat that in case you missed this webinar or you missed any of the prior webinars in the series, you can go to the xSEL Labs website, and under resources, the resources menu, there's a link called webinars. If you click into that, all of our recorded webinars will be available for you to review at your leisure. So I welcome you to come and view early and often. The second thing I just want to let folks know is that next week, we're going to be hosting a webinar on Tuesday at noon Central Time that is related to this series, but is somewhat separate from it. And in that webinar, Mark Greenberg of the Penn State University and the founder of the Create for Education Center, Bridget Hamry, co-founder and CEO of Teachstone, and I will be presenting briefly on 3 approaches to supporting student social and emotional development. Dr. Greenberg will be talking about teacher wellness and its role in quality instruction and student outcomes. Bridget Hamry will be talking about teacher instructional practices that we know are associated with student academic, social, and emotional outcomes. And I'll be talking about assessment and the role of assessment data in supporting consistent, high-quality SEL practices. We're also extremely fortunate that David Adams, the Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly, will be joining to facilitate a discussion after Bridget and Mark and I present briefly. Okay, so with those announcements out of the way, I would like to start by getting to know all of you a little bit. I know that in the chat window, many of you put in some introductions of yourselves, but I want to get a sense of your sort of incoming knowledge and orientation as we start this webinar. So what we'd like to do is ask you a poll question. And Nova, if you could launch the first poll, that would be awesome. So for this first poll, I want you to respond to this item. I know what relationship skills mean and how to assess and teach those skills. Definitely, more yes than no, sure, or no clue. So go ahead and take a second to think about where you're at with relationship skills and let us know your comfort in assessing and teaching those skills.
All right, looks like we've got a great participation in our poll. I'm going to go ahead and end it and share out the results. And Clark, I'll let you comment on that.
All right. Well, this is very interesting. It looks like we have a handful of black belts who definitely have this nailed down. We have some who, most are pretty confident, but maybe feel like they have some room to grow, and a handful who are feeling less certain. This is great. I think wherever you are on that spectrum, I hope that you'll get something out of this this time we're spending together, even if it's confirming what you already know. But even for those folks who are black belts, I hope that you learn some new stuff from our conversation today. Okay, so I want to, let's see. First of all, acknowledge the wonderful partnership that we have with Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District. And Paul Bauer in particular has been a terrific teammate in developing this webinar series. It was really his brainchild. And last week, he and his colleague Ryan Moss put on a terrific webinar about how they're putting many of the ideas that we're discussing into practice with the school districts they serve. And I want to just acknowledge again how wonderful it is to work with the team at Traverse Bay Area. Paul is on this webinar. I'll be doing most of the yakking today, but he will be available to answer questions and address issues as well. Okay, so today we're going to focus on relationship skills. And we're going to focus on relationship skills as they are described in the Michigan Social and Emotional Learning Standards. But as was the case in prior editions of this webinar series, I want to just highlight that even though we're focusing on Michigan's SEL standards, what we're talking about is relevant to everyone. Relationship skills, as you see from this slide, is one of the 5 CASEL competencies, and CASEL's model, I think, is the most widely cited and widely used conceptualization of social and emotional learning. So even though we're talking about Michigan, we're also talking about relationship skills as it's described in the broader education community. And every state that's adopted social and emotional learning standards describes relationship skills as one of the sets of competencies that students should know and be able to demonstrate. So again, this is focused on Michigan, but I hope that even if you're from out of state, you see the relevance of this discussion to your practice. Okay, so in the Michigan standards, there are 3 broad areas that are described under relationship skills. Standard 4A is use positive communication and social skills to interact effectively with others. Standard 4B, develop and maintain positive relationships. And Standard 4C, demonstrate an ability to prevent, manage, and resolve interpersonal conflicts in helpful ways. Now, if you have been to some of the prior editions of this webinar series, you can probably anticipate where I'm going to go with this next. And that is, we're going to focus on one of these competency areas, because across these 3 deceptively simple sounding statements are a wide number of interrelated competencies. And it would take 3 webinar episodes to discuss each of them. And in my view, 4C of the 3 of these is the most clearly operationalizable in terms of being able to visualize what it looks like in daily life, being able to describe how one can assess it both formally and informally, and in terms of teaching strategies, ways to teach this competence in ways that we know produce measurable benefits to students. So why do relationship skills matter? Let's talk about that for a second. Why does demonstrating an ability to prevent, manage, and resolve interpersonal conflicts in helpful ways matter? Excuse me. This may seem obvious, but I want to ground this competence in something concrete, because it's often easy, I think, to lose sight of what we're talking about because these are just words. Well, what do relationship skills look like in the real world? Some of you may recognize one of these slides. Bonus for those of you who do. Here is a classic example of a conflict. Two children who are arguing over possession of the same toy. It looks to me like a shovel in the sandbox. If you think about most interpersonal conflicts, they probably boil down to some variant of this kind of interaction. So we saw this. This is the slide. I'll just give it away. This is the slide that we showed in the webinar episode on self-management. And in that episode, we talked about, well, it's important to cool down and manage your emotions before you're even able to resolve the conflict. And that is very true. But once you've cooled down, the question here is, how could these two actually work through this conflict? What are the range of solutions that they could actually come up with together or individually to work out this problem? That is what relationship skills is about. The self-management is important, and the relationship skills problem-solving element is important. Relationship skills and problem-solving are really pretty much, I won't say always present in interpersonal interactions, at least in terms of conflict resolution, but very, very often. People see things differently. They have different ideas about how things should go. They have different ideas about who should go first, about how things should unfold, about who should take possession of different things. There are all kinds of ways in which we have different views of things. And when we have different views of things, that is the sort of foundational set of ingredients for conflict. Conflict is not bad. It's natural. It's normal. It's inevitable. Between friends, as in this circumstance, between kids in a sandbox in the prior slide, and in fact, in your lives too. I don't want this discussion of social and emotional competencies just to be about them, just to be about kids and their challenges and opportunities. It's also about all of us. So I want you to take a minute to think about, when did you last have a conflict with somebody, and what did you do to resolve it? I'm going to guess you don't have to think back too many days before you can come up with something. If you feel comfortable, I'd love it if you would share at least the kind of broad description of what that conflict was in the chat box and what you did to solve it. I'll pause for a minute and we'll come back to the discussion. Okay. If you have other ideas, other conflicts, feel free to type them in the chat as they come to mind. I really appreciate that several people did put in conflicts they had. One of the more humorous ones was somebody had a conflict with their computer, and it frustrated them tremendously. Who hasn't had a conflict with their computer? I would say with computers, it's kind of hard to engage in a problem-solving process with them unless you're a coder. And but I appreciate the humor in that example. Oh, and there are more pouring in. These are great. I mean, I'm not glad that you had the conflicts, but these are great examples. So thank you so much for sharing these. Now, we can't go through all of them and talk about what you did to resolve these issues. However, I'm glad that you had a moment to think about the connection between relationship skills and your own lives. I really feel like it's important as we go about the work of trying to support students in developing these competencies, to think about how they apply in our own lives, because social and emotional learning doesn't end in 12th grade. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about how to assess social and emotional learning, in particular, how to assess relationship skills. Now, I'd like to actually ask you for some information about your comfort and familiarity with assessing relationship skills. So Nova, can I have you launch the second poll, please? Okay. So for this poll, I want you to respond to the statement, assessing relationship skills is, how would you fill in that sentence? A piece of cake? Possible but not easy, verging on the impossible, or a complete mystery? Let us know what you think of the ease of assessing relationship skills.
Okay, thanks to everyone who participated. And Clark, here's the results for you.
Well, it looks like possible but not easy is the clear, far and away winner, although we have a couple intrepid souls for whom it's a piece of cake, and a few who aren't as bullish on the possibility that we can actually assess relationship skills. So this is great, and it's a great place for us to begin this discussion about general strategies for both a formal and informal assessment of relationship skills. Let's start by talking about sort of formal assessment approaches. So there are 4 different ways that we can think about assessing relationship skills, as is the case with most social and emotional competencies. The first is here through direct assessment. And in direct assessment, children demonstrate their competencies by solving challenging tasks. Now, remember, we're talking about relationship skills in terms of conflict resolution or social problem solving. And so a direct assessment, this is an example from the assessment that xSEL Labs offers, SEL Web. Children hear about hypothetical, challenging social situations. In this case, you see a group of kids playing at recess. When you ask if you can join them, they don't say anything. So it's a classic peer entry challenge. Kids are asked to imagine they're in that situation, and then we ask them how they would want it to turn out, which gets at their social goal orientation. Would they like to get back at the kids, or would they like to work out the issue? Those are very different kinds of goals, and they lead to different behaviors. We ask, what would you do in that situation? Which gives you a sense of children's preferred solutions. What kinds of solutions do they generally elect when they're faced with challenging social situations? And then we ask, if you did that thing, what would happen next? So we're getting at children's predictions about the consequences of their behavior. And through having children respond to hypothetical social situations, challenging situations, we get a sense of their kind of problem-solving preferences, approaches, and strategies. It's a direct strategy to get at social problem-solving skills. Other tactics include self-report. Many self-report questionnaires exist out there where children rate their own competencies. For a sample self-report item might be, I know how to work out problems. Not at all true to extremely true. So children rate their own competencies. Or teacher report. Teachers rate the frequency of behaviors reflecting social and emotional competence. In terms of relationship skills, an item might be resolves conflicts with others, almost never to almost always. So that's the teacher's perspective on relationship skills. So each of these assessment approaches has strengths and weaknesses. I will say we're working on a research project to look at the relationship between self-reported self-competence and direct assessments of social competence. And we actually find that children vary in the extent to which their ratings of their own competencies agree with their competence as directly assessed. And a bigger predictor of outcomes than children's ratings of their own competencies is how closely their ratings match the direct assessment. So kids who have an accurate view of their competencies tend to do better on a range of outcomes compared to kids who either overestimate or underestimate their competencies. So self-report is a bit of a complex mix of actual competencies and children's biases about their competencies. Teacher report, similarly, these are assessments and ratings that are viewed through the lenses of the teacher. Each of these can be quite valuable, but they each have their own pros and cons. And then finally, some use administrative records to get at social and emotional competencies. I don't know that there are any administrative records that directly or indirectly assess relationship skills per se in the way that these other tactics do. But there are things like office discipline referrals and other regularly collected administrative data in school districts can give you kind of a broad sense of the extent to which kids are resolving conflicts constructively, although it's a little bit distant from the competence itself. So I described this in the last slide, but basically for direct assessment of social problem solving, children's responses to hypothetical challenging social situations where they say what their goal orientation is, where they select the kinds of problems they prefer, and where they anticipate the consequences of their actions is a really nice way of getting at this. And it tends to be quite strongly predictive of outcomes that we care about. Now, if you were a district like Traverse Bay Area districts that uses SEL Web or direct assessment, what can you do with these assessment data, or how do they get reported, and what do they look like? Well, for SEL Web, districts get plots, for example, that show the percentage of students who score well above average, in the average range, a little below average, and well below average overall. And then in terms of several different social and emotional competencies, we've discussed some of these already, but this bar reflects children's social problem solving skills in this particular classroom. These kinds of plots are available for the district, school, grade level within school, and classroom. And what you can see is that for this group of students, social problem solving, for example, is an area of relative challenge where only half of the students are in the average range or above. And other areas, other competencies, more children did better on the assessment. So you can start to get a picture of the strengths and needs of students through a differentiated assessment like this. There are informal assessment strategies. I guess you can see one of them that I'm going to talk about in a second. But in addition to kind of the formal assessments that have established psychometric properties that you could use to really get a high quality snapshot, it's important to be able to assess in an ongoing way, in a curriculum-based way, as it were, a student's relationship skills. So how do you do that? Well, in schools that have morning meetings, or closing meetings, there are plenty of opportunities to discuss, to surface conflicts and challenges that have come up, where students can describe what's going on, and then they can work through together how they think about what the problem was, what their goals were in facing that problem, different ways they could solve it, and then evaluating the pros and cons of those different kinds of solutions. And then through children's, this is both an instructional opportunity, give kids a chance to sort of flex their relationship skills muscles in terms of that 4C standard of conflict resolution. They get to flex those muscles, and you as a teacher get to hear how each child is responding to these questions, giving you ongoing feedback and data about how well students are developing these kinds of social problem solving skills. It's also, I think, with relationship skills and social awareness in particular, for those two CASEL competencies, it seems to me there are so many opportunities, especially for younger children, but also for high schoolers, to embed both formative assessment and instruction around relationship skills into literacy instruction. So imagine, because why is that? Because every story worth its salt has at its core conflict. There's always a conflict between characters and situations in really good stories. So this provides an opportunity to ask both about, of course, the story, the lesson, the grammar, the reading skills, all that. But if there's a conflict between individuals in a story, asking students to describe how they understand what that conflict is, to say what they would do if they were in that situation, to generate alternative ways that a character could deal with the conflict at hand. So again, it's informal, it's in the flow of instruction, but it provides, I think there are plenty of opportunities in the context of literacy to both practice relationship skills and get an informal sense of students, a sort of formative sense of students' skills as part of those literacy exercises. And now this third bullet, which you saw a preview of because my animation was off, in playgrounds and unstructured settings, oh my gosh, those are amazing kind of hothouses of conflict, right? It's when the rules are loosened and kids kind of have to figure it out themselves. How do you decide who to sit with at the cafeteria? How do you decide what to play in the playground and who's in charge, who goes first, who gets to use the shovel in the playground? All unstructured settings are wonderful opportunities for instruction because conflict is inevitable in those settings. So to the extent that you are present in those settings and conflict arises, it's an opportunity to have students stop and with guidance, as little guidance as you can offer, but no less, and have them think through what the problem is, to generate alternative solutions, to weigh the pros and cons, to make a decision about how they're going to proceed. Plenty of chances for kids to flex and strengthen problem-solving muscles in unstructured settings. And then finally, in any one of these contexts, particularly morning meeting, playgrounds and unstructured settings, and other moments when conflict naturally arises, there's an opportunity to enlist the support of peers in engaging in a constructive social problem-solving process. So I think the astute observer will notice conflict arising early and often in peer contexts. And I think that it's not too much of a stretch to think of those as opportunities to both assess students' developing abilities to engage these relationship skills and to support continued development of those very same skills. Okay.
Clark?
Yes.
We had two questions come in really relevant to this segment just before we transition into the addressing, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just touching on the frequency of those formal assessments between like the teacher rating scale, the student rating scale, and the direct assessment. And then also the role, does parent surveys or parent rating scales come into play under the umbrella of the formal assessment?
Okay, that's a great question. Great couple of questions, actually. And so the first one about the frequency, I'll actually address more thoroughly near the end of our presentation because I am going to talk about a kind of model of integrating formal assessment into SEL instruction. But briefly, the great thing about formal assessment is it provides, I think, a fairly rigorous snapshot of student competencies at a given point in time. The limitation is that you can't do it every day. You know, for direct assessment, for example, I think the maximum number of times I'd ever recommend using a direct assessment over the course of a school year is 3 times, in the fall, a midpoint, and a year-end assessment, kind of like benchmark reading and math assessments. More often people administer in the fall and in the spring. Now, why is that? That's because that kind of assessment, like reading and math assessments, are vulnerable to practice effects, so that if kids take the assessment a whole bunch of times, they might score better because they're getting better at taking the test, not because they're acquiring the competencies. Similarly, for students' self-report questionnaires, I think kids can really get burned out on filling out questionnaires And so the issue is of how often you think you can get a valid snapshot of student competencies using self-report questionnaires. And I don't know the answer to that in terms of the frequency. Some of it depends on the extent to which students are going to feel that the data are being used and to do productive things. I know a lot of students who are in districts where self-report questionnaires are used to assess social and emotional learning feel motivated to do so to the extent that they see adults changing their practices in response to what they say, and conversely feel less motivated when they feel as though the data are just going somewhere and not being acted upon. And then with teacher rating scales, I'd say that again, it's to some degree a question of capacity, because many of the rating scales have lots of items per student. So if you have 25 students in your class and you have to fill out a 50-item questionnaire for every student, that's a pretty big commitment of time and effort. And how often can we expect teachers to do that before they start to feel burdened by the assessment obligations? I will say that there are some progress monitoring tools like direct behavior ratings that have a lot of promise to be less burdensome to teachers, but provide more frequent progress monitoring data around social and emotional competencies. So there are other creative ways to get at more frequent assessment, but I think for the kinds of formal assessments we're talking about, the short answer is a couple times a year. I think gives you good data at the beginning of the year to use to plan instruction, and then good data after a period of instruction to evaluate student progress. Now, as I was yammering on, Paul, I forgot what the second question was. So if you give me a little prompt, I'll answer that and try to be a little briefer about it.
That was perfect. The second question was just the role parent surveys play. Does that anchor under a formal assessment? Student and teacher was noted, but just wondering about the role parent surveys play.
Yeah, I think a lot of teacher rating scales have both a parent version and a teacher version. Some do and some don't. I don't usually mention parent ratings for a couple of reasons, and I'm not sure that I'm totally right about this. But I feel as though when it comes to social behavior, teachers have a really unique window into students' behavior because they see a lot of it, and they see a lot of it in a structured context with peers. And so, and parents see their children's behavior in a really different kind of context, and may have their own kind of frame of reference for making ratings of student frequency of behaviors. So I tend to, for the purposes of instructional planning and educational application, feel that teacher ratings are probably give you a better picture of student social and emotional competence that's actionable and usable than parent ratings. Now, we know that parent and teacher ratings of behavior are correlated. There was a pretty extensive study done of this in the 90s. The average size of the correlation between parent and teacher ratings is 0.3. So a perfect correlation is 1, no correlation at all is 0, and 0.3 is kind of like, you know, it's there, it's significant, but there's a lot of difference in the points of view. So I think for clinical evaluations, for kids who have frank attention problems or disruptive behavior, and you're really doing a clinical diagnosis, it's absolutely essential to get both teacher and parent point of view. But for more formative assessment to guide instructional planning and SEL resources at Tier 1, I'd put my money on teacher ratings over parent ratings. Others may disagree with me, but that's just my point of view on the relative merits of these two perspectives for planning purposes. Okay, so let's shift gears to how to address social and emotional learning, in particular relationship skills. And I'm pretty sure that this is the time for our third poll, because I want to get your perspectives on not just assessing SEL, but addressing it. So the poll item is, in my district, A, We offer regular explicit instruction in relationship skills and plenty of chance for students to practice. B, how much to teach relationship skills is up to teachers. C, we don't offer explicit instruction in relationship skills, but it's part of our culture. And D, we don't really work on relationship skills. Go ahead and pick the one that best characterizes how things are in your district.
Okay, thanks for everyone who participated in that poll. Clark, here are your results.
Okay, so again, there is variability with about a quarter doing explicit instruction and lots of opportunities for students to practice. About 2 out of 5 have discretion at the teacher level to do instruction. And another quarter look like it's kind of part of the culture, even though it's not explicit in the instructional, in the curriculum. And about 1 in 11 don't really work on relationship skills. So that's a nice variety among you, and that helps me to understand where we're starting in this discussion about addressing conflict resolution and other skills related to it. Let's talk about some both formal and informal ways to address relationship skills. Okay, so I always think starting with your data is a good idea. And as we mentioned in this classroom, social problem solving, which is part of relationship skills, is a relative area of need for this group of 26 students. So the question here is, what can this teacher do to maybe spend a little bit of extra effort in explicit instruction on social problem solving? Well, one thing, let's imagine that this is a district that was using the ruler curriculum, which is one of the evidence-based SEL programs. And I highly recommend using an evidence-based program because we know that when they're done well, they're highly likely to produce a measurable benefit. And ruler is one of those programs. Now this table shows the lessons in the ruler scope and sequence. This is for kindergarten, but there's similar program alignments for all the grades. And these are the competencies that SEL Web is designed to assess. And this column shows problem solving, okay? So you see that, that this class has relative challenges in problem solving. Problem solving focused lessons. So the check marks basically mean the lesson focuses on that competence. If there are 2 check marks, it means that's kind of the main focus. That competence is the main focus of the lesson. Okay, so in this case, the curriculum doesn't really get to a high concentration of instruction on problem solving until near the end of the year. So I think there are questions in this situation about, are there ways to consider offering supplemental instruction or previews of lessons earlier in the school year to give students a more robust opportunity throughout the school year to learn and practice social problem solving skills? You know, it's not changing the evidence-based program, it's simply using data to guide your use of that program. It may also be possible to bring in supplementary resources, like there's a wonderful program called Move This World, which is a video-based social and emotional learning program that offers exercises taught by really cool young adults who, for 4 or 5 minutes, talk about emotion management, self-awareness, conflict resolution, and other skills. And it's possible, I think, to use subsets of some of those lessons as a supplement to some of the other formal scopes and sequences that are available. So I think one has to think creatively about how to address the needs that are identified. But if you start with the data, that then gives you a kind of roadmap to what you need to focus on. Okay, so that's formal instruction, and that's a whirlwind tour. There's a whole lot to talk about there, but that gives you at least a little taste of linking assessment to instruction. What about opportunities for practice and reinforcement? Because let's imagine you have an SEL curriculum and the formal lessons are for 15 minutes 3 times a week. That's not a lot of exposure to explicit instruction. So for those lessons to take root and be generalized to children's daily practice and learning, there really needs to be opportunities for reinforcement of those skills. So how do you reinforce social problem solving beyond the explicit instruction? Well, I think with this, and we talked about this with self-management, but with relationship skills too, it's important to have a theory of the thing you're trying to teach so that you can hang your informal coaching and instruction onto that theory. So this is very busy, and I apologize for that, but I'll walk you through it. This is from Lemeres and Arsenio from 2000. This is the modification of a social information processing theory that Nikki Crick and Ken Dodge developed in the 90s. And the important part about this is they basically said, whenever confronted with social information, including in conflict situations, we go through a series of steps, not necessarily in order, but there are a series of things that happen in our minds. One, we encode the cues that we see. Essentially, we're kind of making sense of the visual things that we're seeing and organizing them into what is going on here. Second, we interpret those cues. We make attributions about the causes of others' behaviors, for example. Did they do that thing because they intended to be mean? Or did they bump into me in the hallway by accident? That's an interpretation of the cues. Third is we clarify our goals. Are we essentially intending to work out this issue, or are we interested in retribution or revenge for a perceived slight? Those are very different kinds of social goals, and they lead to different kinds of response, access, or constructions, basically generating the kinds of solutions that are available to us to respond to the situation that we're confronting. And then we make a response decision. We enact the solution. Okay, so there are lots of other little pieces in here. Our history, our emotion processing all affects this, but this provides a kind of idea of the different steps that are involved in social problem solving. Now, how can you translate that theory, which seems a little 30,000 feet, into practice? Well, when there is a problem, and this is really straight from social problem solving skills focused interventions, you can think about several different steps that kids need to be able to successfully undertake to solve the problem. One is they need to stop and calm down. You know, you can't solve a problem if you're just being reactive. Two, kids need to be able to articulate or say what the problem is. Problem identification is super important because it's hard to solve a problem when you're not sure what you're trying to solve for. Third, and this is kind of optional, but I think is important, figure out how you want it to turn out. What's your goal in this problem? Is it revenge, or is it to play together? I say optional because I don't think it's necessary always to go to goals to get to generating alternative solutions, which is the meat of the matter. Okay, you've stopped, you've calmed down, you said what the problem is. What are some of the ways that you could solve this? Have kids generate those alternative solutions with the goal of helping them expand the repertoire of solutions available to them. They could be good ideas, they could be bad ideas. This is like brainstorming. The idea is to get out as many solutions as possible because next you're going to evaluate the pros and cons of each of those solutions. Okay, and then you help kids to weigh the pros and cons, which is really about thinking about the consequences of each of these solutions in evaluating how well they're going to help the kids achieve their goals. And then kids pick the best solution based on their evaluation of the pros and cons. And finally, after they've executed it, reflect on how it turned out. Now, this seems, I think, sometimes a little bit wooden or artificial. However, if you actually use this kind of problem-solving process with kids, it's not telling them the solution to a variety of problems. It's teaching them a way to think through and resolve problems. And it can be a little wooden to begin with. However, it really works. I mean, there are a lot of evidence-based social problem-solving skills programs that operationalize social problem-solving in this way and instruction around it in this way. And I think we could all imagine a situation, a conflict that comes up on the playground or in the cafeteria, where it would be possible to walk children through these steps with the least amount of guidance possible, but no less, to help them to both learn the skills and resolve the problems. So this kind of general framework, if you have and maybe it's not this, maybe it's some other idea of relationship skills, but I guess what I'm encouraging you to do is have a theory of what the kind of pieces of the process are that you can then use flexibly in informal contexts to teach this competence. Okay, so there's a lot of formal instruction in evidence-based SEL programs. There are some SEL programs that are focused really almost exclusively on problem-solving skills training, and there are plenty of opportunities to reinforce these lessons informally. But I think it's really important to have a framework to be able to do that effectively. Now, I want to go back though for a second. This is, so the first step in the process that I just described for you is stop and calm down. All right. So for the astute among you, you might have noticed that that sounds suspiciously like self-management, which we covered in a previous webinar, okay? So this is all by way of saying that these competencies are not totally mutually exclusive. They are related to one another, and self-management and problem-solving in particular are interdependent on one another. It's hard to, problem-solving skills get short-circuited when emotion management is not in place. But emotion management is not necessarily enough to be able to solve problems. The two go hand in glove. So if the challenge in supporting a student's social problem-solving skills is the stop and calm down part of the process, then you go back to your go-to theory of self-management and help students to learn those self-management skills. This is stuff that we covered a couple of webinars ago. I won't go over it again, but if you want to review, that webinar is available on our website. Okay, so let's take a minute just to pull this all together. I promised you that I'd talk about how one can use formal and informal assessment to guide the SEL practices in your setting. So a lot of our partners who use SELweb use this kind of practice model that I'm going to share with you. You can use this practice model with any assessment and evidence-based intervention. In the fall, assess student social and emotional competencies and review the data to determine where the strengths are, where the needs are, and use that to do some planning. Now that planning can be around how you use your explicit instruction, your formal SEL curriculum. It can also be around how you pull in supplemental resources to teach the competencies that you think should be an emphasis for groups of students. And it can also be around, what strategies are you going to use in these informal contexts? What opportunities are you going to be looking for across the course of the day to reinforce the most important competencies? So collect the data, review it, make plans based on the data. After a period of instruction, reassess students' social and emotional learning skills and review the data to see what kind of progress students have made. That is, and then use those data formatively and begin the process again in the fall. This is a way to use social and emotional competence assessment data formally to guide instruction, measure progress, and then you can use some of those informal probes along the way formatively to see how students are doing. It's also possible and desirable to measure things like climate and implementation of programs as part of this cycle. But somebody asked earlier sort of how frequently to assess, and I hope this puts that question in a context of like, why would you assess in the fall and in the spring? What would be the purpose of doing that, and what would be the value of doing that? This is a practice model that I think really works well to set a course and see how you've done. Okay, so that is all I have in terms of our formal presentation. I invite you to get in touch with me if you want to follow up on any of this. And we have a few minutes left, so if any additional questions have come in, happy to have a discussion. Any other things that we want to cover, Paul or Nova?
One question did come in, if you don't mind just addressing it, is in your numeric sequence of steps about the identify and calm down. The question was just around, is it acceptable to allow students to vent and blow off steam as part of that de-escalation sequence?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think there are kind of two answers to that, and they are yes and no. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Blowing off steam in a kind of strict sense, like, just primal screams or punching a pillow or kind of getting it out of your system by yelling, screaming, and otherwise acting aggressively, actually doesn't work to regulate emotions. It kind of makes people more upset. Eventually they tire out and can come back around. So it would not be my go-to emotion regulation strategy. So on the other hand, if by vent you mean step away from the evocative situation and spend a little bit of time using an emotion regulation strategy to cool down before coming back to the problem to resolve it, then I think that is entirely a constructive thing to do, because what you're doing is you're telling a child, hey, it's important to calm down. Go do what you need to do. Maybe use one of the strategies we talked about. When you feel that you've gone from a 9 to a 3, come on back and we'll talk about this. If that's what you mean by vent, I think I'm all for it. But if you mean by vent kind of the catharsis model of get it out of your system by really expressing anger in a loud and quasi-aggressive way, I don't think that, and I'm not opposed to it. If it worked, I'd say go for it. But I think the evidence is that it's not a very effective emotion regulation strategy.
There's a couple of other questions. One of the questions that I would have for kind of the good of the group is thinking about the arc that most of the state competencies or state standards has. And relative to this conversation, we think about at the early L level in this conversation about students having kind of a menu of options and how to deal with this. And then as they progress into the later elementary, it's about understanding the difference between destructive and constructive problem solving. And then when we get into the more middle school, high school level, it's about knowing how all parties engaged in conflict can get their needs met through some sort of resolution. How do you encourage schools grapple with grade spans versus student behavior demonstrating where they sit on that continuum?
It's a big question, and I guess my sort of like little answer would be refer in some ways to the grade level descriptors in the standards, because they will describe specific competencies within relationship skills that kids at different grade levels should know and be able to demonstrate, and that I think could help be a guidepost. So that's number one. Number two, I think in my view of social problem solving, and I think the evidence supports this, this idea that it's a process that kids can use flexibly when confronted with all kinds of different situations is helpful, because that, I don't think, if you take that as a constant from early elementary all the way through adulthood, let's face it, then the question is, for young children, how do we start teaching this process? What is the thing that's most important to help them learn some skills for resolving conflict? And for young children, maybe it's really about the stop and calm down in particular, because self-management is such an important job in early childhood. Maybe I think a lot of the social problem solving skills focused SEL programs are kind of focused on late elementary through middle school. And we know that when kids learn the steps that I described and are able to deploy them, it really reduces aggressive behavior, increases pro-social behavior and other outcomes. So I think that's where the sweet spot of like being able to teach all those steps is. And then when you get to high school, of course, we've talked about this before, but one of the challenges with high school is that high schoolers don't like to be taught social skills because often they find it to be patronizing. And then you get, they turn off and don't feel respected and maybe even get oppositional about it. I'm overgeneralizing here, but I think there is some evidence that explicit instruction of these kinds of skills can be counterproductive, at least in a group setting. I do think that for middle schoolers and to some degree late middle school, the idea of kids being engaged in meaningful group activity that is important to them, and then using the conflicts that come up in those circumstances as an occasion to coach them through a problem-solving conflict resolution process is much more likely to be effective because you're helping them to get to something that's important to them. It's a bit of a shift from the idea of explicit instruction to the idea of explicit, informal coaching. But I really think there's growing evidence that that is the effective approach. But I don't think that problem-solving steps change all that much in high school. I hope that's helpful in thinking through the developmental stages.
Absolutely, and I know you're going to be up against the clock, but we do have one important question that just came in, if you don't mind addressing it in the last minute here.
Sure.
The question is relative to knowing that schools and classrooms all have different climates. Do you have any suggestions for how to best coordinate SEL assessment in a middle school and high school where students have a variety of teachers over the course of a day?
I knew somebody was going to ask that. That's a hard one. I do think that, so we, for example, my colleagues and I are developing a middle school social and emotional competence assessment. And my presumption is that the competencies that students demonstrate in the context of those assessments are going to be relatively constant across teachers and across settings, so that you can get useful information about the students and what they're bringing to whichever class it is from that kind of assessment. Climate assessment, on the other hand, I think climate assessments are usually done in a couple of different ways. Often climate surveys are given and students are saying how safe they feel, how much they feel like they belong, how much they feel they're supported as learners in the school overall. And so if the measure is of school climate, then that kind of takes away the issue of, things are different from one class to another. If, on the other hand, your interest is in understanding how climates are different in each classroom, then you might be in a difficult situation of having to ask those questions with regard to math class, English class, history class. In math, I feel safe. In math, I feel like I belong, right? So I think there are trade-offs of each of those approaches. I'm not sure if this is really getting at the nut of the question, but I do recognize that, once education gets departmentalized, it becomes a little bit of a different matter, both assessing and addressing social and emotional competencies.
Thank you. That's all the questions at this point.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, for fielding the questions, and I want to thank everyone who was able to come today for your participation. Again, I would encourage you to consider enrolling for the upcoming Tuesday webinar, and we will keep you posted about other webinars as they develop and as we schedule them. So thanks once again, and thanks to Nova and Rebecca for their support. We'll talk to you all soon.